The owners, and I don't remember the year, but it was near the fifth year, I would think, because they then wanted to calm the game down even more, and they voted for a six foul rule, which meant that when a team made a sixth foul, they had to designate a player to go into the penalty box for a 2-minute penalty, so-called like a team penalty. And that changed the game dramatically because teams then didn't want to risk a foul, so they didn't high press, and no one wanted to take it a foul in the attacking end. So the teams wound up playing zone, and the scores, as a result of that transition, the scores went from 10-9 to 3-2 and 4-3, and I was even at one game in Pittsburgh 0-0 that had to go into overtime. Changed the game for the players, changed the game for the referees, and definitely for the spectators, and I think it was a very bad mistake.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hey there, everybody. How are you? Tim Hanlon here, and Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports is where you are at. Thank you for downloading us, streaming us, or whatever method you are using to get said audio files into your earbuds. We thank you kindly for giving us a try, and hopefully we will stimulate those earbuds and the ears that hold them for the next hour and change with our very special guest, a soccer Hall of Famer, recently announced, the U.S. Soccer Hall of Fame, National Soccer Hall of Fame is the official title. His name is Dr. Joe Machnik, and if you're a fan of the Fox Sports broadcasts of professional soccer, especially on the world stage, you will know Dr. Joe very well as the inimitable source of all things officiating when it comes to soccer. And most probably know, and if you don't, you'll regale in some of the stories that are part of Joe's background in a decades-long, I want to say 6 or even 7, well, about 6 decades-long Renaissance experience and life in the world of soccer in this country. And Dr. Joe has been there as a player, as a coach, as an administrator, as a referee, as an overseer of all referees, as a rules maker, you name it. Dr. Joe Machnik has probably done it in the sport of soccer in the United States, and a couple of the stops in his long and often illustrious and sometimes tortuous career are stops in the world of the indoor leagues of the 70s and early 1980s, the Major Indoor Soccer League, and it's one of its successors, the American Indoor Soccer Association. And we even get into a bit of the early days of Major League Soccer back in the mid 90s, just after the World Cup here in the United States. And Joe's role in becoming the rule overseer and the referee manager and wrangler for that league until fairly recently. So a rich soccer history. We're going to delve into a couple of different components of it with our very special guest, National Soccer Hall of Famer, Dr. Joe Machnik, in a couple of seconds. Again, we are sponsored by our friends at Audible. I do want to remind you that it is always in good taste to go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and give it a free trial for yourself. Get a free audiobook download from Audible, will you? It's a good thing for you. You can cancel at any time. It's a good thing for us because we get a little scratch for that. And what better way to support your favorite podcast, wink, wink, nod, nod, than by going to audibletrial.com/goodseats to get one of over 180,000 titles to choose from. Yours for free, one of those titles, not all 180,000 of them, of course. And there's so many different genres that you can pick from. Sports history certainly does not have to be the genre to choose from, but pick one, give it a try. It is free to try. You can cancel at any time, and there's no, frankly, easier way to do it than audibletrial.com/goodseats. You know it, you love it, you can't live without it, you got to try it. And we, of course, thank you for doing so. And we thank Audible, of course, for allowing us to continue to promote their fine service. You know I love it, and I think you will too. All right, so promotional blabber now is complete, And we waste no more time in our conversation. Let us begin that conversation, with our friend, Dr. Joe Machnik, the National Soccer Hall of Fame inductee, and some of his interesting times in the old indoor soccer leagues and also Major League Soccer in the 90s. Here's our conversation coming up. So I guess maybe the first area to sort of talk about, Joe, obviously you're now Hall of Fame officially. Congratulations, career.
Thank you.
It did not start with the old MISL, Major Indoor Soccer League. Perhaps as a prelude to that fun and frivolity, you can give us a little bit of a synopsis of how you began your very robust and dedicated career in the sport of soccer here in this country.
Well, I actually played a little bit. I learned the game in high school in Brooklyn Tech High School, Brooklyn, New York, and I sat down in a class next to a gentleman whose name was Andrew Sheparovich, and he was of Ukrainian descent. And we started talking about hockey because the Boston Bruins had what they were calling the Yuki line, Busick, Stasiak, and Horvath. And he said to me something to the effect, well, you know about hockey, but do you play soccer? I said, no. He said, would you like to try out? You could be our goalkeeper. And he took me up to the gym on the 8th floor of that school. And because I knew a little bit about angle play and stuff, it actually came easy to me. And I got recruited then after high school to Long Island University. And I was myself and Ray Klavecka. That name might mean something to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we were the first two players recruited with financial aid for soccer at LIU, and we helped turn that program around. They were 0-16 the previous two seasons. First season we were 5-5. Back then, I'm talking 1961. Colleges played very limited schedules, not like today. So and then I went and played junior soccer for the Ukrainians and then for the first team. And that's how I met Walter Chisowitz. And that name also should have meaning to you because he went on to become the U.S. national team coach and director of coaching. And while playing for the Ukrainians, we became really good friends. And even though we were coaching at different, respective universities, he later coached Philadelphia Texas. I was at New Haven. And I eventually got my A coaching license in 73. And he asked me to go on a trip with him with the Olympic B team to Puerto Rico for 3 games. And I did. And the first 2 games were very, let's just say, unfairly refereed, at least in our opinion. And he knew I was doing some refereeing in Connecticut in the amateur leagues. So he convinced the Puerto Rican Federation to allow me to referee the 3rd game of that tournament. And then, he got a good sense that I was able to referee. And he also knew I knew hockey because, as I told you right from the beginning, so when indoor soccer first started to come around and it was being played in hockey rinks and the MISL was first being formed, and the office was in Philadelphia where he was located, Walter became a consultant for the first MISL, and they asked him, who should be our referee in chief, and he recommended me, and that's how that got involved in the beginnings of indoor soccer.
Well, so legend has it that Ed Tepper and Earl Foreman back in, I don't know, maybe in the early 70s, maybe 74 or so, I don't know if they were involved in or they happened to see an indoor game. I guess it was an exhibition, and I guess this is prior, maybe the beginnings of the NASL sort of experimenting with it. I guess there was a Russian soccer team involved and all that.
Yeah, actually, I know a little bit about that because the game that really turned it around was a game in Philadelphia between the NASL's Philadelphia Atoms and a Russian Army team. that got played in the Spectrum. And Ed Tepper, who was a Philadelphia real estate business person, saw the game. He also was part owner of the lacrosse team in Philadelphia. And he surmised that indoor soccer shouldn't be a series of exhibitions. The NASL was playing a kind of exhibition tournament in the winter with a different. Well, they didn't have a goal built into the wall, so to speak. It was kind of haphazard, and so he thought that the indoor soccer could be a league of its own, but he knew that he couldn't get it done on his own. But he was friends with Earl Foreman, who had a successful management career in several sports. He was part owner of the Philadelphia Eagles. He owned the Virginia Squires of the ABA and signed Dr. J. Julius Erving and was instrumental with that red and white blue ball that they had. He was involved in the early days of NASL because he was part owner of the Washington team. So they became partners, and they set out to get franchises in a league they were going to call Major Indoor Soccer League. The office was going to be in Philadelphia. And they got 6 franchises in the first year to start the season. And I was the referee in chief, and that meant that I had to train the referees. And I also wanted to referee myself. I refereed the first game, Cincinnati at New York, at which Pete Rose kicked out the first ball.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and that was in Nassau Coliseum. And I refereed, I don't know, maybe 150, 200 of those games in the early parts. And it was really, they were unbelievable. The second year, 4 or 5 more teams came in: Buffalo, Hartford, St. Louis, others. Some NASL teams actually came over and joined the league. It was the best soccer in the United States for a period of time, early 80s. The games were fantastic.
Yeah, no doubt. So let's back up for a second. So you're basically doing all things soccer that one could actually do in this country, right? Which was, let's be honest, a relatively fallow and dry soil, I guess, for compared to where we are today as a sport, right? How does even a conversation like that come about, right? So obviously you're pals with Walt. Obviously Walt, a major figure. Certainly at that time with the fledgling national teams, plural, of American soccer. How do you, make that leap from, being essentially a coach and a referee and I suspect other sort of administrative aspects of soccer into jumping into becoming not only sort of in charge of referees for this fledgling MISL, but I got to think you even have to question your sanity a little bit, because is this really soccer, right? When you think about it, in the middle of the 1970s, indoors.
Well, I don't know that. I mean, some people called it socky because it wasn't really soccer. We had time penalties, we had timeouts, we had penalty box, we had goals, 10, 12 goals a game. So it was certainly not, and it was played mostly run and gun. There was, very little defensive strategy. The whole idea was that it was going to be a spectacle. I don't know. I don't know what exactly you were asking me, but, the fact that I coached a little bit, the fact that I refereed a little bit, I had some administrative abilities because by 73 I had gotten, PhD in recreation leadership. So I don't know. It was a learn as you go kind of a deal. And one of the things I have to mention is that since the office was in Philadelphia, I was living in Connecticut, in New Haven, and Earl Foreman was living in Washington. But when he would come up to the office, they would notify me that I would come down to the office. And we actually had an apartment that we shared together. And it was during this time, not during the day in the office, so to speak, but at night, at dinner and through the night, because he didn't sleep very much, that I really learned the ins and outs of sport management and league administration, and became, he put his arm around me. I was like a son to him. And and they shared with me most of the inner workings of the league. So it was kind of special for me.
Well, I definitely want to get into some of those inner workings in a minute. But before we go further, I do want to get a sense of how the rules, based on your knowledge of it and how you came into it, how did the rules of the MISL come into being in the first place, right? It's one thing to be a referee for those rules, but...
The playing rules, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, who made them up?
I did.
So
No,
Dr. Joe Machnik, so wait a minute, we're breaking news here on this podcast. Dr. Joe Machnik, newly inducted into the National Soccer Hall of Fame, is now claiming that he was the creator of the rules, the original rules for the Major Indoor Soccer League.
That's right. The NASL had a rule book for their exhibition tournaments that they ran, and I took that rule book and modified it greatly. And especially, they had a rule that said if something happens in the game that's not mentioned in these rules, the outdoor rule applies. And of course, as we refereed in that first year, there was so much that happened that wasn't in the rule book. We were constantly rewriting it and sending out bulletins to the teams and to the by fax. And don't forget, there's no email back then. So we were kind of making it up as we went along, Indiana Jones style. Do
you remember some of the first or major rules that you adopted or changed from the NASL's early attempts at it?
Geez, that's a really good question. A lot of them had to do with time penalties, because what happens if one player from each team goes into the box and one team scores a goal, does the player come out? All these things were hockey stuff that I had to put into the rules that were non-existent previous to that. So I don't remember anything specific, but it's quite some time ago. But if you ask any of the original referees, they would tell you that we were making it up as we went along.
How did you train those folks? Not only the referees, but also the players and the coaches and anybody else in the beginnings of this fledgling league, right? Because in essence, you're going to have you have 6 teams that have to play a game that they have to kind of learn, right?
Right. We identified, I think, 17 referees. We brought into Cincinnati for a several-day clinic. Among those was Billy Maxwell, who was in the NASL, Gino DiPolito, whose name you must recognize, Artie Wachter, Guy Fratour, some quite a few established referees. Also, we were trying to bring in some geographically located to where the teams were, because in addition to the referees, we needed to worry about travel, but we also had what we were calling the alternate official, who was not on the field. Back then, it was one referee on the floor, one official at the midfield line off the floor, and 2 goal judges. And so we went through. Cincinnati had a practice facility, so we refereed a couple of their scrimmages as practice, and then we went out and I can't tell you that we met with the teams. I don't remember that we met with the teams to explain the rules, but we certainly distributed the books. And if things happened, I'm sure things happened to where the players questioned early on also, what's going on here? And we explained it as we went.
Where did you find most of the referees? Did they come from the NASL? Were they also from hockey or other places too? Or just curious as to where
they all had to be U.S. Soccer referees because we were part of U.S. Soccer. So they all had to be U.S., registered U.S. Soccer referees. Some of them whose names I mentioned came from the NASL, and some, a couple of that I knew from the Connecticut State League. And then every year we added more as we added more teams. And then what happened, and this is really interesting, I think it was year 3 or 4 when we had a championship weekend in Cincinnati, in St. Louis, and where it was like a Final Four weekend. And it was also the opening weekend of the NASL outdoor season. And we had made the assignments for our Final Four weekend, and Bill Maxwell and Gino were on our list to be assigned to do those games. But the NASL also signed them to do games because there was rivalry by this time between the leagues. So the NASL also signed them to do games in the outdoor league. So we had to get a police escort for them from the airport to get them to the stadium in time. And it led to the formation the following season of the first full-time group of referees for soccer in the United States, when we hired 6 referees full-time that would only do indoor, 6 plus me. And so that was a big step for us, because now we had referees who were thoroughly familiar with the rules and thoroughly familiar with the players, and we had players who knew the referees when they walked into the building. They weren't seeing different faces every weekend, because we only had those 6 guys plus myself. And I had, by that time, cut my schedule down and didn't referee as much, rather to manage the program.
So that in essence was a full-time gig then for the first time, right, for these referees, correct? Or at least in the realm of soccer?
Absolutely. It was a decent salary. You were talking, I would say 1982, 83, and you were talking $32,000, and that was a decent salary back then.
So so you're mentioning some of the tensions with the NASL. I mean, when did that really start to hit? Did that hit kind of immediately when the league got going, or was it kind of tolerated until these overlaps started to happen?
Actually, when the league got going, there was a good level of cooperation. The NASL saw an opportunity for their players to stay in shape by playing in the MISL and also having the MISL pay their salaries. So in the first 2 or 3 years, the NASL and the MISL worked pretty closely together. But then teams in the outdoor league started to fold, and there was contraction, and then there became competition for those players rather than cooperation.
Well, it's also, I'm sure the NASL and Phil Woosnam in particular was not over time particularly excited at the prospect of seeing the game that arguably they created or at least brought to the mainstream, frankly, kind of being, I guess, hijacked very successfully into its own league and success and a rocket ship of success in the early 80s. I'm sure there's a lot of jealousy, and then obviously we saw the NASL decide that they too were going to get back into it once or twice.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. I believe that's correct.
So did you? All right. So let's get into some of the day to day. So this MISL. I mean, did you think it was going to last more than a year? Did you think the idea had validity? And I got to think that some of the initial games and as people were feeling it out, were a little, shall we say, comical or curious, to say the least?
Well, I mean, obviously we were attracting some soccer fans, but there were fans of other sports that were coming to watch the games as well, because it was being advertised as, quite a spectacle. And you're familiar with the steam and the cheerleaders and halftime shows and all of the things that the MISL did, in addition to playing the soccer. So it was quite an entertaining package. So we attracted fans who were not only soccer fans, but fans of all sport. And it started to grow. The crowds, especially in certain cities, the crowds, were quite large, St. Louis in particular. Wichita did very well. Buffalo was really good for a while. I never during the time I was working there thought it was not going to last. I don't think that was the thought of any of the owners. We didn't think like that.
We had Michael Menchel on a few episodes ago, a longtime publicist and an executive in and around the MISL, and he regaled us, and we also talked to Kyle Rote Jr. for a little while about some of his exploits with the Memphis Americans, and obviously doing the MISL Game of the Week on the USA Network cable with Al Troutwig.
Right.
I got to think that it was a curious thing to sort of referee these games where the players and the coaches were, I guess, certainly in the first season, kind of feeling their way through. How long did it take to for folks to kind of get it, and kind of specialize in this and sort of elevate this to more of an art and a sport than a curiosity, probably for the first couple of months?
Well, in the first couple of years, everybody was on a cooperation kick, because everybody wanted to see it work. So there was very little, at least that I know about. Maybe Michael, being inside of a club, might see it differently. But everybody seemed to cooperate, with each other. It wasn't really until the first coaches, I guess, got fired for not making the playoffs, that they began to feel pressure, and therefore would, beyond the referees and become difficult to manage, or the players become difficult to manage. But we would say among the referees that if you could referee indoors in the MISL, then you could referee anywhere, because you were making a decision for every 3 seconds. I mean, you weren't blowing the whistle, obviously, but something was going on every 3 seconds, and you put yourself so close to the players that player management was the key. And if you were able to manage the players in the indoor league, then the outdoor league became, much easier to officiate, because you had so much time and so much space, and so the frequency of the decision making was so less. So, but as the league grew, the tensions grew greater, and the pressure to make the playoffs and then do well in the playoffs. Obviously, there were incidences that had to be dealt with by the disciplinary committee and other committees, whatever, just like any other league.
Well, look, if I remember correctly, I think the pressure also became much greater on the referees. If I remember correctly, I mean, both watching games and look, you're also talking to somebody who was maybe one of the small handful of season ticket holders for the hapless New Jersey Rockets for their almost one season. The intensity of some of these games, especially these rivalries, right? Certainly the Arrows and the Steamers and the playoffs and all that. I got to think the referees, and I know it for a fact. I remember, it became a little bit of a tenuous and almost dangerous situation with the fans and the players, where the emotions and the passion kind of spilled over, certainly even more than I remember seeing in the old NASL outdoors.
Well, that's true. And the game, like I said, there was a decision to be made every 3 seconds, but we had to adjust to that as well. And especially in the playoffs, which like in any other sport, basketball, hockey, football, the intensity raises in the playoffs, and our playoffs got to be pretty tough to a referee, with just one referee on the floor and another referee off the floor who had a whistle. And in some games, that referee off the floor was blowing the whistle as many times as the referee on the floor. So then after one playoff season, with the pressure that we were feeling, and myself as the head of the referee program, it was decided that we would take the referee off the floor and put him on the floor, thereby making it a 2-referee system, and then add another referee off the floor. So you were dealing now with 3, and that helped calm it down, because you had another set of eyes, and therefore stuff that was happening off the ball was being dealt with better. But even still, the owners, and I don't remember the year, but it was near the 5th year, I would think, that they then wanted to calm the game down even more, and they voted for a 6-foul rule, which meant that when a team made a 6th foul, they had to designate a player to go into the penalty box for a 2-minute penalty, so-called like a team penalty. And that changed the game dramatically, because teams then didn't want to risk a foul, so they didn't high press, and no one wanted to take it a foul in the attacking end. So the teams wound up playing zone, and the scores as a result of that transition, the scores went from 10-9 to 3-2 and 4-3, and I was even at one game in Pittsburgh 0-0 that had to go into overtime. Changed the game for the players, changed the game for the referees, and definitely for the spectators. And I think it was a very bad mistake.
Interesting. That's very interesting. And arguably people could look at sort of the arc of the MISL. Certainly it had success in the latter part of the decade as well. But you look at some of the old video of those first 4 or 5 years. It was very run and gun, very intense. Some of it was novelty, no doubt. But it did seem to be a bit more freer flowing and a little bit more, I don't want to say seat of the pants, but a little bit more sort of manic and maybe some of the excitement, I guess, that people weren't used to. Was there any discussion about maybe reverting back to the pre-6 foul rule, or was that pretty much in cement going forward after that?
Well, one of the benefits of the game being played with the 6 foul rule was that injuries were down. So if injuries are down, player budgets are under control because you don't have to add new players who can't play anymore. So the owners were happy on the one end of it because there's always a financial concern back then. But I don't recall any discussion of going back to the run and gun game. There was also a tactic developed. If you can visualize, there were 5 players on the field and 1 goalkeeper, but most of the teams after the 6 foul rule, and some even before, developed what was called a box and 1. So 4 players back in a box and 1 player who stayed up front, and that player would be like a Steve Jungle or a Freddie Gugurev, Kai Hoskevy, or Preki, someone with extreme goal-scoring abilities. So the key was to, win the ball in the back with your 4 and then make a long pass, or even the goalkeeper make a long pass as long as it bounced in the middle third to this player who either would be on some sort of a breakaway, semi-breakaway, or had the ability to hold the ball until others would join in the attack. So, and that changed the game a little bit also.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just 2 of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. How about any personalities in the referee corps? The Gino Dippolito is certainly a name that I remember. I remember names like Felix Fuchsman. I'm trying to remember a few others. I don't know if Herb Silva was one. But are there any names or personalities that stand out in your mind?
Well, both Gino and Herb were among the full-time corps that were hired that year that we hired 6. And Gino was the most had the most personality. And when I see a player who played in the indoor league MISL way back then, and we get into a conversation, one of the first questions they'll ask me is, how's Gina? Because the players loved Gina, and he was tough, and he understood but he understood the game, and he understood how to manage people, and he did most of our more difficult games in championship games. Herb, he took over when I left the league to go coach the Arrows. Then Walt Chisowitz took over for a year to run the referee, but Walt's refereeing was never in Walt's bag of tricks. So then Herb Silva took over the program and stayed with the program well into near the end of the league, I think.
Very interesting. Let's talk about that. So you're in the league, you're running the referees, there's a professionalization and a growth of the league. I mean, to the point where I think in some cities it was even outdrawing an NBA. Like I know in Kansas City was outdrawing the NBA's Kings at the time. The Steamers obviously doing phenomenally well at the gate, and a number of others.
Yeah, we had a couple of very good entrepreneur managers, the Leiweke brothers. That name should probably mean something because one of them is still involved in soccer. But there was Terry Leiweke, who was doing our TV. There was Tracy Leiweke, who was doing Kansas City. There was Tim Leiweke, who was Terry Leiweke, who was, I'm sorry, Tracy was in St. Louis. One of them was in Kansas City, and then of course Tim Leiweke later came on to try to keep the Arrows alive. But they were all involved in the league, and they were all had great ideas and for making the game a spectacle. But go back to your question, please.
Well, no. So it's interesting you bring up the Leiwekes. I mean, a fantasy of mine, maybe someday we'll actually do this, is I'd love to get the three of them together in one room. Obviously, have gone on to great things in their own particular careers. Yeah. But just to banter back and forth. Four
of them, yeah.
Sure, I'd love to get them into one room and have a conversation about those early days, because obviously a lot of what they've gone on to do was begun and gestated in the MISL. I guess my question is, well, now that you brought them up, I mean, I also got the sense, and our previous guest Michael Menchel kind of touched on this. I get the sense that the league had a lot of I wouldn't call it incestuous, but a lot of sort of cross-pollination, maybe, around management and teams and how things were going. Not to the point maybe where the league was propping up certain situations, but I did get the sense that it wasn't just management of individual teams these owners were sort of part of. They were also kind of, I don't know, co-conspiratorially trying to keep the league going. Is that a fair assessment from an outsider's perspective?
I mean, the owners, made an investment, and they were, had to protect their investment. And when the league began to fall on hard times, obviously they tried to help each other. And so, for example, John Luciani owned the New York Arrows, but Bernie Roden owned the Baltimore Blast. But they were partners off the field in business. David Schoenstein owned the Kansas City Comets, but was later took over the Arrows when John Luciani said, I'm not making this work in Nassau Coliseum. We're competing against the Islanders, who have just won 4 Stanley Cups, and we're throwing good money after bad or whatever. And so David Schoenstein then owned 2 teams for a while, and there were I don't know that there were other what you called incestuous relationships, but certainly you can't have a successful team in a successful market unless you have people to play against. So yeah, the league was trying to prop up some of the teams that weren't doing as well.
Well, I guess I was sort of laying that out because I was maybe thinking that was a little bit of a background to maybe how you became involved actually jumping sides, so to speak, to become an actual coach of a team versus running the officiating for the entire league. You want to maybe give us some sense of how you got to the Arrows and behind the bench?
Well, it's kind of an interesting story, at least to me. My contract expired at the beginning of a particular season, I think year 5, and I was working throughout that season without a contract. Obviously, I was getting paid; that was not an issue. But I felt it really important that the person who was in charge of the referees and also on the disciplinary committee have a contract to protect himself or herself, from any situation where that person had to deal with, which might fall, fall like on hard times for a particular team or player. So at the All-Star break, I had a meeting with the commissioner foreman and some of the owners and expressed the need, that I needed a contract to continue. And I was told that they would love to have, almost in a quote, they'd love to have me continue to work, but they couldn't give me a contract. And this was not, I couldn't do that. So I was offered the position. David Schoenstedt was moving to the Arrows. There was going to be a change there. The coach, Don Popovich, was going to San Jose. He was taking Steve Junga with him, some other players. They were going to try to make the Arrows so-called Team Long Island, make it more of an American team, and they saw me as a coach who could help make that happen. And I tried my best, but it didn't work out.
At what point did you start the season? I'm guessing this was the last season of the Arrows, right?
I came in for the first game right after the All-Star Game.
Was that the All-Star Game that was at Madison Square Garden?
No, it was in Kansas. It was in Kansas City, I believe.
Okay, but the season with the Arrows, this was 83-84. I'm guessing their last season.
No, next to last.
I'm sorry. Okay,
I came because then. So the next to last season, I finished that second half of the season, and then I started the first half of the following season.
All right. For our completists out there, that's Joe is referencing the 82-83 season as the second half of that, and the first half of the 83-84 season, which wound up being the last for the Arrows. Right.
It was a very difficult time because we obviously we're working on a reduced budget. David Schoenstedt was selling off players. Diego Pesa went, I believe, to Kansas City. Mark Leverage went to Kansas City. Freddie Krueger went to Memphis. The team was not going to make the playoffs, but I'm not sure at that time that making the playoffs was what they really wanted to happen, because that would have cost more money to play. So I was actually fought, to keep those players, and I lost the battle.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that, for those who don't remember, the Arrows were the closest thing to a dynasty that the MISL had in the early part of its life. And, those star players. Yeah, they won four consecutive championships. And in essence, then, there's a retooling of the team where also these star players and an importation, I guess, of the American player, which is a noble and long-term benefit, of course, but when a team has been known for being sort of a champion and a stalwart and a force in the league, when it changes ownership, changes team mechanics and the players and the vibe around that team, it's no easy feat to inherit that change, right?
That's correct. So you mentioned the All-Star Game in Madison Square Garden. Of course, growing up in New York City, that to referee that game was. I would say in my top 10 thrills of all time, regardless of whether it was indoor, outdoor, or anything else, assistant coach of the 90 World Cup team. But so that was a major thrill. And one really funny thing happened there. Earl Foreman brought with him a guest who he, saw as a potential investor in the league. And during he handed him the portfolio of everything, about the league and the teams and all of that. And during the game, that gentleman, whose name is escaping me, but you can remember, you look it up and you'll get it. During the game, the guy began to draw on the thing, and he actually drew the goalposts and lines for what became arena football. So arena football, instead of that gentleman investing in indoor soccer, he started the Arena Football League and drew the field and everything during the All-Star Game played in Madison Square Garden.
Yeah, I think you're referencing Jim Foster, who is somebody on our list that we absolutely want to have on the show going forward, because this is the irony of all of this, right? So you have a sport that was itself a mongrel from outdoor soccer, hockey, a little bit of basketball, right, into its own sort of new sport with a new rule book and all of it. And from that, derivatively, another sport, right, which borrowed elements of an outdoor game and indoor soccer itself to create arena football, which is still around today. It's limping. It's only 5 teams, but it has lasted for quite some time in most of its original state. And that's ironic. I fair disclosure, I was at that game as well. There was something magical about that game. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that wound up being the only ever MISL game played in Madison Square Garden. I wonder if that...
No, I'm sorry, I have to correct you.
I stand corrected. Go ahead.
There were 3 games that were Hartford Hellion home games, I think, played there. One of them was against the Arrows. I think there were 3 league games played there in that same season after the All-Star Game.
I did not know that. And I can't imagine they were nearly as well attended as that MISL All-Star Game.
No.
All right,
I think Hartford was already really struggling, and they thought they could do better in Madison Square Garden. They moved those games there. I know one of them was against the Arrows.
All right, well, we'll put that out to our fans. For anybody who was at the MISL All-Star Game in New York City, that was on, February 11th, 1981. The most valuable player of that game was Adrian Brooks, for those who really know. A crowd of over 13,000 at that game. And if anybody was at those 3 games or so that Joe was mentioning that Hartford played in Madison Square Garden afterwards, I'd love to hear your thoughts, remembrances, and hell, if you have a photo or two, Hellions get it. That would be great too. That's an interesting little factoid that escaped even me, which happens on occasion. All right. Well, so as the MISL experience, was winding down for you behind the bench as a coach with the Arrows. How did this segue to what I think is an interesting concept in and of itself, a challenger league to the MISL in the what was then called the AISA? How did you get involved in that fledgling operation, and why?
Well, so I was let go from the Arrows, and I got a phone call at home from Louisville. The Louisville Thunder, one of the owners, called and said, "We need somebody to run the office for the rest of the season. Would you mind coming out?" And obviously, I wanted to have something to do and all of that. So I moved out to Louisville for a couple of months, and I lived in his house and ran the office. And that was a pretty good team. Keith Tozer was on that team. He was the coach. He was the player coach. Tommy Mulroy was on the team. Jim Gabara. Mike Noonan, who's now coaching at Clemson. Zoran Sabic, who's assistant coach at Kansas City. So it's quite a good team. And between that, there was, good players in the league, and it was Rock'em Sock'em also. And so I ran the Louisville Thunder, and then was asked the following season to be director of operations for the whole league. And so then I did that. And then I think the next year I was commissioner for 1 year. And then World Cup fever I was asked to be the assistant coach for the World Cup team. So then I left that job to work with not only Bob Gansler on the outdoor team, but John Kowalski with the five-a-side team.
Sure. So let's back up for a second. So the AISA, the American Indoor Soccer Association, according to my notes, it kind of got going around, I think it officially started in the spring of 1984. And I guess it was announced obviously a little bit earlier. But am I correct in remembering or understanding that the unique approach to the AISA versus being a challenger league to the MISL per se was that it was designed to be as exclusively an American player-based circuit as possible?
I think that what was unique, first of all, was they wanted to be playing in smaller cities. Every city had an arena of different sizes with open dates. I mean, in fact, this was one of the reasons MISL, the original MISL, thought they could make it, because there was before a lot of concerts. I mean, concerts fill arenas now, but arenas had a lot of empty dates. So they thought indoor soccer could fill those dates. And there were arenas in these small cities, Fort Wayne, Kalamazoo, Louisville, Columbus. Some of these cities are now big cities, but they were small cities back then. So part of that was that, here's an event that can attract in these smaller arenas 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people a game, and you'd have 20 dates to play, that you didn't have otherwise. I don't remember, Tim, that there was any exclusivity that players had to be American. I just don't remember that.
It may have been sort of maybe the original intent, but I can certainly see that, the smaller cities, maybe even it was envisioned as somewhat of perhaps a farm system for the MISL. But interestingly, as time went on, and perhaps during especially your commissionership, it kind of almost became more of a direct competition or ultimately the survivor or successor of the MISL over time when it even changed its name, right?
I didn't stay that long. It's still, after I left to work with the national team, AISA, I think it changed its name, eventually to NPSL or whatever. But it continued to go, and after MISL folded, but it didn't have, with all due respect, the quality of play, because it was low budget. It was a bus league, and didn't have the quality of play that the original MISL had, and so I'm not so sure that the game was, even as attractive. But it was still a good entertainment package. But I don't know. I think we would have rather at that time become a farm system and get support from the MISL, but the MISL was not in a position to be having a farm system at that time.
All right, before I get it. So before we move on from indoor soccer for good, I'm just really curious as to what was what was the life of refereeing and/or playing in the MISL. You say bus league for the AISA. I can certainly understand and imagine that's very minor league. But the MISL was certainly not necessarily, caviar and champagne either. And if I remember correctly, some of the schedules, back-to-back games in different cities, and the number of games which became more numerous as the seasons went on, I got to think that the game took a toll on players and referees alike, travel as well as the play and the just the grind of the road.
That absolutely, and we mentioned the full-time referees. So the 6 full-time referees that we had, they were doing upwards of 200 games, in a season, both on the floor and off the floor, and so it was certainly stressful for them as well. But they travel by air, the referees, for the most part, and they had a good per diem and a good salary, and it was better than anything else they had ever gotten. So it was for them, as for some of the players, it was really big time.
All right, well, let's get to how you got back into the outdoor game, which obviously was, how can I best put it, professionally kind of going sideways. Obviously, the demise of the NASL, you had the rise of indoor soccer. You mentioned some World Cup fever and the beginnings of sort of the 4-year cycle becoming, something of a, on the radar of United States players and coaches. Maybe you can give our audience a bit of a sense of how you sort of segued from largely an exclusive indoor kind of experience back into the outdoor game. And then I guess on the doorstep of MLS eventually in '96.
Well, interestingly enough, in the AISA, when the Chicago team could not get a building to play in because it was a university owned and it was used for so many other events, they would play some games in Rockford, Illinois. And the director, the manager of the Rockford, Illinois Metro Center was Doug Logan. And Doug Logan became the first commissioner of MLS. And he remembered me and the work that I did in the AISA, not only with the referees, but organization and elsewhere. And while he couldn't bring me into MLS in the first year of MLS, they had lots of officiating issues in that year. And it was time they thought that they needed someone to work in the MLS office who would work with U.S. Soccer and then later the Canadian Soccer Association when we got some Canadian teams who could manage the referee programs from an MLS point of view. In other words, be MLS's voice with the federations. And that's the job that I took for year 2 of MLS. And then I stayed from year 2 to, I guess, 17. I was there 15 seasons.
Do you remember the game in particular that kind of put it over the edge for you to come in and help professionalize this refereeing situation in the league?
Well, it was my interview. I got a call on Labor Day from Sunil Gulati, who was deputy commissioner.
This is in September of 1996 for those paying attention.
And he called me from Mexico, actually, and said, we're interested in talking to you about, managing a referee program, setting up a program for the league. Because that first year of MLS, over 200 different officials have worked games. I mean, it was very haphazard, to say the least. So he said, we'd like you to come down and be interviewed. And so the first person to interview was going to be Bill Sage, who was vice president of operations, and I would be in the operations department. The referee services would be in operations department. So we managed to do the interview around a game in what was, I guess, Giant Stadium at the time. So it happened to be a game in which ended in a tie, and they went to the MLS shootout. And then, as I remember it, Peter Vermes was playing for Metro Stars, but finished the game, but was injured and couldn't participate in the shootout. And it became a whole controversy because they were still requiring at that time a list of the shooting order to be given to the referee. The referee was Essie Bahamas. And this was no longer even a rule in outdoor that you had to give a list of the predetermined order of shooting. That the rule was in outdoor as it is now. The 11 players who finish go to the center circle, and the coach determines what the order is, but the referee doesn't have to be told, and the order is not mandated. You can change it as it goes as long as nobody takes a second shot before everybody has their first. So it got very confusing. I think there was a protest involved, and da-da-da. And then I'm walking out of the stadium with Bill Sage in the underground of the stadium, and we walked past the referee's locker room, and Essie Bahamas happened to come out, and he saw me, and he worked for me, in the AISA, and I knew him from MISL. I was on the floor with him in his very first MISL game in Wichita, and he kind of said, please help us. And when Bill Sage heard that, then I think that helped me get the job. So if you ask Essie Bahamas, he'll tell you he got me the job.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're a Metro Stars fan, obviously prelude to the current Red Bulls, that game was, I think, the first playoff game in their history, and they won that game over DC United 6-5 in a shootout. I think it went 11 rounds, and I'm sure it would have even gotten more hairy had it gone to a 12th round, because you had basically 11 players or so would have been exhausted from who had been remained. Now, I guess the question on that would be, since you came in year two, what was the discussion around the shootout, and when was it put out of its misery? Probably not necessarily because of that game, but as a tiebreaker and the embrace, I guess, of a tie as an official result.
Well, actually, I liked the shootout in my first year of employment. I then brought in the so-called shootout clock, which were really expensive items, over $10,000 a piece, and we got every team to have one, because in the first year the referee was keeping the 5 seconds on his stopwatch, and nobody knew the official time as to whether the shot was taken prior to the 5 seconds expiring or whatever. So we had the shootout for a couple more years, but the fans didn't like it because it wasn't real soccer. They thought the players didn't like it, especially a lot of star players refused to take. You go into this shootout, and some of the really good players didn't want to shoot in the first 5. There was also injuries that took place because there were collisions between the goalkeeper and the shooter at times, and even with the clock, there was still controversy. And then, now that I was in charge of the referee program, I was seeing referees having a solid 90 minutes, and then, for want of a better word, screwing up the shootout, and therefore the whole thing, is thought as being bad. So eventually, we voted to become more like the rest of the world in soccer, and we got not only rid of the shootout, but we put the time of the game back in the referee's hands, because in those first couple of years, the time was kept on the scoreboard like it's in college with an official timer.
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who was a fan of the old North American Soccer League, I mean, maybe has a bit of a hagiography, a fondness for those old NASL 35-yard line shootouts. That I know I certainly did, but obviously those came after sudden death overtime, right, which is still somewhat verboten in soccer, certainly in international circles. I don't know. Versus penalty kicks, if there has to be a decision, I at least like the idea personally. My opinion really doesn't matter, but of the a bit of variable, component to it versus just sort of the methodical, left or right. And, it feels a little bit more dramatic to me. As somebody who has been part of overseeing refereeing, and obviously now in your role with Fox Sports and decidedly being sort of the arbiter and the voice of God, I guess, when it comes to refereeing decisions and on soccer telecasts. What are your thoughts about the penalty shootout or the old NASL shootout, or frankly how games are ended both internationally and or in league play? Is there any perfect way, or do you have any preferences from what you've seen over your storied career?
Well, first, one of the things that really, should begin to make a difference, okay, they've now added a 4th substitute, whether you have permission as a league to add a 4th substitute in your overtime period. But I don't understand why it's not greater than that once overtime starts, because you have a bench, full of players who haven't played, and the true strength of a team could be measured by the quality of all of its players, not only the 11 that start. Now, you would still have your 3 substitutes in regular time, but once you go to overtime, let's let everybody play. Let's substitute 5, 6, whatever the coach wants, but open it up and have a real 30-minute game where the team with the stronger bench, which should be the stronger team, may have a better chance of winning, and then there's not so much luck involved. So I don't see why they don't go that way, and that would be my recommendation for a more soccer way to determine the outcome of a tied game. in regard to the penalty kicks, I mean, there's been so much cheating on the parts of the goalkeepers in penalty kicks that you wonder. You've seen so many games decided unfairly with the goalkeeper 2-3 yards off the line, and the referee not making the shot be taken over because the save, the save was illegal. And okay, so FIFA changed the rule and said now the goalkeeper must be cautioned, but they still have a word in the rule book called blatant, and the referee is to decide if there's blatant movement off the line forward. So it leaves it up to the referee, and really should be a black and white situation, which the referees need to have better control of if we're going to decide a game with penalties.
What are your thoughts of the VAR, video assistant refereeing system that the MLS is, I guess, basically trialing for FIFA and the world body? What are your thoughts? Good, bad, indifferent?
Well, we've had, fortunately, I've had some experience at Fox with VAR because it was used in the Under-20 World Cup, it was used in the Club World Championship, and then it was used in the Confederations Cup. And the key to the successful VAR actually is good referees. Because if you have good referees, then you don't need to go to VAR as often as one might think necessary. If obviously they want to review every goal, but by reviewing every goal, what's going to happen is you're going to find that some goals are scored because a player is, several millimeters offside. And you're going to, and as happened in the Confederations Cup when Chile had a really fantastic goal disallowed that nobody knew was offside until the VAR picked it up, and it was like by a hair. And so we're going to see more goals taken away than will be created. And I don't know that that's good for the game. We just don't have enough experience with it yet to see what the effect will be with penalties. Will there be more penalties given than not given as a result of the VAR? I mean, will the VAR be saying, no, that wasn't a penalty, give it as a simulation or give it as a goal kick or whatever? And so that's another part too. And the third part, whether it's a yellow or a red, I mean, there's no referee who has given a yellow wants to look at a videotape because the VAR has brought him over and said, you need to take a look at this, and he's going to change his mind and make it a red. That's kind of hard to swallow. It will happen, and it probably will happen and be correct in some instances, but we've already seen yellow cards be given when reds were clearly deserved, i.e. the same team, Chile, with that elbow to the face of Germany, where the referee had, to the German player, where the referee had all the time in the world to look at it and still showed a yellow when it was 100% red in everyone's book.
Given your lengthy experience and dedication, frankly, to the sport, do you see, envision either in the U.S. or on the world stage, or maybe even suggest any rule changes that could be brought into play? I mean, there are some out there that we've all experienced those dour 0-0 ties. That there's a defensive mentality. Our friend Paul Gardner from a number of episodes back, certainly is not a big fan of sort of the English style defense first kind of play. Are there any things that you, in your wisdom, could even think of or suggest that could, I don't know, speed up the game or improve the game, or are we kind of maybe at the level of perfection right now on the world stage?
Well, I would certainly like to see more support for the referees controlling and awarding the amount of added time that needs to be awarded. We've seen so many cases of 5, 6, 7 minutes of time wasted. Not only through injury, but through goalkeepers holding the ball, through other situations such as the substitute having known he's coming off the field, taking a full minute to walk to the touchline. So an easy rule change will be when a substitution being made, then the substitute must leave the field by the closest line, and then the substitute can be brought on. It's not, I mean, that rule, any substitute can leave over any line. That rule exists now, but they choose to come all the way to the touch line, to get the applause, but also to waste time, especially when they're on the team with the lead by a single goal. So if the referee had the ability to add the real amount of wasted time, we would see added time of 5, 6, 7 minutes, and that would do a lot to change how the game is being played.
Nothing in scoring, nothing in number of substitutes, approach to breaking ties, none of that. You think that's fair for now?
We've already talked about substitutes. I've had a big career in college soccer officiating, where some teams are substituting 3, 4, 5 players at a time. That's not what soccer is about. Soccer is actually started without substitutions. And the first game I ever saw on television, I think it was in 1962, was the FA Cup final between Leicester City and Tottenham Hotspur, and a guy was forced to play with a broken leg. They put him on the outside left because there were no substitutes, and he became a walking player. But they, three seems a good amount. And the other one I would like, now that you just made me think of something, this concussion thing. So if a player gets an injury where he goes down and is showing signs of a head injury, I don't want to say concussion because that's a doctor's determination, but he's showing signs of a head injury and should be given all of the time and all of the concussion protocol, there should be allowed a substitution for him that does not count. In other words, if he comes back into the game, the player who substituted for him comes out. And then so that everyone is playing with 11. It's usually an accident, usually a head-to-head when there is a head injury. So it's no fault of either player. They're challenging for the ball with their head. And if a player needs the 6 minutes or 7 that a normal concussion protocol sometimes by a good doctor takes to take place, then that team shouldn't be forced to be playing with 10 while that happens, because that puts pressure on the doctor and the coach and the team to get that player in there too soon. So I think that would be an important rule change to be thought about.
I think that's a great idea. And I would imagine somebody like Taylor Twellman, who's been a big advocate for concussion protocols and recognition of the issue in the sport of soccer, might be a very good backer for that. All right, well, let's get to one last question, and I promise this will be the last one, and it's probably the most important question of the entire evening. I think our audience really wants to know, what were you doing, and how did you find out that you were chosen for the National Soccer Hall of Fame?
Thank you. I was in San Jose because Fox had the final of the Gold Cup, and I got a call early in the morning around 6:30, and I looked at my phone and I didn't recognize the number, and I hadn't yet really woken up, so I didn't take the call. I didn't answer it, and about an hour later, but I did. There was a voice message, and when I did wake up, I saw the voice message, and that I knew that I missed a call from Hank Steinbrecher. So about an hour after that, he called a second time. Obviously, I answered, and I, was obviously very surprised. I think this was my third year that I was nominated as a builder, and I really didn't expect to be named or inducted, but I was obviously thrilled with it. And then it just so happened it was the day before the game. So Fox was having a dinner for all of the staff and the producers that, come in and said, we had done a nice job with the Gold Cup and they wanted to treat us to dinner. So I announced it at that dinner prior to having even told my family, because I couldn't sit on it anymore. I was so excited. So I announced it at that dinner, and, everybody was really pleased and gave me a standing ovation and all of that. And And then, I told him, you can't say anything on the air tomorrow because of the game, because I haven't even told my family. So that's why when Fox did announce it on the All-Star Game, the day before it became officially announced by U.S. Soccer, they got permission to do so from U.S. Soccer. That's why Rob Stone said, Barbara, I hope Joe has told you by now, because I had made that statement that I hadn't yet told my family. But so he mentioned her on the air and said, I hope he's told you by now. We have a new member of the Fox family that's in the Hall of Fame.
And I thought that was great. I thought what Rob did was, that was great. And frankly, why not tell the soccer community, who obviously has known and been a big champion and has benefited from all your endeavors. And there's, you are truly a Renaissance man. I know it's been said otherwise in the sport of soccer. And I know we've kind of dredged you into some of maybe the more dark pockets of that. But the body of work is substantial. It's rich, and it's obviously very well deserved. So congratulations on being the latest inductee, and it's with all due and all merit for sure.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be nominated or being inducted with Brianna Scurry, who was a fantastic goalkeeper, as you know, and is well deserving. And I'm really happy to be on the same docket, so to speak, or in the same year as Brianna is being inducted.
So a couple of quickies on our way out here. Obviously, Dr. Joe can be seen and heard in a lot of Fox Sports' coverage of professional soccer, both on the world stage and in MLS. And I think is kind of getting a cult sort of following, right, Doc? I think, how many years you've been doing the Fox thing now?
This was my third Gold Cup, so I guess six years if you start, with year one being one. But so about 5.5, 6 years.
Well, and I think it's a great, and frankly, it goes right along with of what Fox has done with football. I think it's a great addition, and it's frankly, I wish it was more universal elsewhere, but we'll take it where we can. But also as we sort of depart, I want to give you a little promotional opportunity. I mean, you've been among your zillions of other things in the realm of soccer. You're still actively involved, I believe, with a well-known and full of legacy soccer camp endeavor. You want to talk about that and maybe give a little plug for it too?
Yeah, well, okay, thank you. Back in the day when soccer was just beginning to happen, there were lots of soccer camps. And you mentioned in the beginning of the show, I mentioned my attachment to Walter Chisowicz, my friend. And I worked at his camp, All-American Soccer Camp at school, and I worked with the goalkeepers, and over those years, I said that we're really not spending enough time with these keepers. They're really being used for the most part as shooting practice. So that we need to do a camp just for goalkeepers. So in 1977, I started the first No.1 Goalkeepers Camp. And we had 39 campers from 13 states come to the Taft School in Watertown, Connecticut. And I guess we did such a good job in that first year that the following year, year two, we had over 200 goalkeepers from 39 states. And then by year three, we began to expand. We went to Chicago and to Dallas and to LA. And at one time, I think we were doing 3,200 kids in a summer. So, and we've had such good luck with the goalkeepers. I mean, Matt Reese, who's the current U.S. national team goalkeeper coach, was a camper. Nick Raimondo, Joe Cannon, Dave Vanoli, the late Dave Vanoli, who was national team goalkeeper for quite some time, and others. John Bush was a camper for 5 years. So, thank you for the opportunity to talk about that. It's still an ongoing phenomenon, and this was our 41st summer. We added strikers kind of 12 years ago, and we do a lot more tactically now than we did in the early years, which was mostly technique, because the kids have technique, and they have good goalkeeper coaches at their clubs, And what they need now is how to apply that technique into tactical situations of when, why, and where to become the next Manuel Neuers of the world.
And the website is?
www.No.1
There you are. And we'll promote that a little bit further in our outros and all that. Dr. Joe Machnik, thank you tremendously. Wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for allowing us to bring you and drag you, maybe kicking and screaming, into your indoor soccer and early MLS days. Congratulations again on your Hall of Fame induction. Hopefully it will be televised, and there will be a location for it, probably to be named, but we look forward to seeing that. And we look forward to watching you on Fox Sports as well, and continued best in your still fledgling soccer career here in the United States. Thank you so much.
Oh, I appreciate this. Thank you so much.
All right. Our thanks to Dr. Joe Machnik, the latest inductee, along with Brianna Scurry, into the National Soccer Hall of Fame. We're not quite sure when and where the official ceremony is going to be. I think some of that is tied up in the actual construction of the National Soccer Hall of Fame, which has been in the process of being relocated from its roots in Oneonta, New York, to Frisco, Texas, and it's going to be attached to the MLS stadium there. I'm not sure when that all goes down. I don't know if that's where the ceremony is going to be, but keep an eye out for it. Dr. Joe Machnik obviously is also a fixture on the Fox Sports coverage of professional soccer. You will see him there, and I think you'll see a bit more of him, especially when as MLS gets more ingrained with the video-assisted refereeing system, which MLS is basically trying out on behalf of FIFA and the World Soccer community. I'm sure Dr. Joe will have some insights and input and activity on those broadcasts, as well as the lead up to the World Cup next year in Russia, and we look forward to many of his insights there too. I think he adds a great deal of information and sanity, frankly, to a lot of the broadcasts about, especially about controversial decisions and such. A couple of reminders here. So Dr. Joe, besides his induction into the Hall of Fame, is, as we mentioned near the end of the interview, is entering in his zillionth year of running and being part of his No.1 Soccer Camps. The website address to find out more about those is No.1SoccerCamps.com. That's actually N-O, the No.1 Soccer Camps, all one word, No.1SoccerCamps.com. And you can find out more about it there as well. So again, thank you to Joe. We appreciate it, and we look forward to keeping in touch, and we appreciate those stories and the like. We also appreciate our friends at Podfly Productions down in Gadsden, Alabama, our professional production team of Eric Begay, Jerry Payne, Corey Coates, David Gregerson. And if you need podcast production expertise, I highly recommend them. Please tell them I sent you. And the place to go for that is podfly.net. That's podfly.net, P-O-D as in David, F-L-Y, podfly.net. We thank them tremendously, as always. Okay. We also thank you tremendously for listening. We thank you so much for finding us on social media. Please rate and review us as well on iTunes, wherever you rate and review stuff. Twitter, that's at Good Seat Still. You'll find us Facebook page devoted to the show. Instagram, Good Seat Still available. Yada, yada, yada. Thank you very much. Take care. We'll talk to you next week here on the big show, Good Seat Still available. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.